Welcome again to the Dean's Conversation Series. I am so thrilled for this session to be joined by Kimberly Merchant, who's the inaugural director of the Racial Justice Institute through the Shriver Center. And we're going to learn tonight about her background, and she's going to be giving our students some advice about their careers, but we're also going to be talking a lot about racial justice advocacy. And I'm excited to learn more about that, and I'm excited for our students, faculty, and staff to learn more about that. So Kimberly, welcome this evening.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Dean, and for having me. Glad to be here.
Let's take a few minutes and have you tell us about your background. Where did you grow up, and how and when did you become interested in being a lawyer?
Wow. So people don't normally know this, but I actually live in Mississippi. I do work for the Shriver Center. It is in Chicago, but based on the job that I do with the Institute, it's really something you can do from anywhere. Pre-COVID, I was just traveling all over the nation, really working with organizations who wanted to do race equity advocacy. But I grew up in the coastal part of Mississippi, called Pascagoula, Mississippi, along the Gulf Coast, really close to New Orleans for folks who may not be familiar with Mississippi. I currently live in the northwestern corner of Mississippi. I'm like 15 minutes from Arkansas. I'm 2 hours from Memphis, Tennessee. So it's like Tennessee on top, Arkansas to the right, to the left. And but I grew up in Pascagoula, Mississippi. It's a coastal town. Went to school there and graduated in 1990. Went to undergrad at the University of Southern Mississippi, which is like central Mississippi. I was a very sheltered child, so didn't have a lot of diverse experience around going to college. And because Southern Mississippi was so close to the coast, they heavily recruited in that area. I was really excited about sort of leaving the coast and having new experiences. So it just was the best fit for me at the time. After undergrad, it sort of rose into my why I became a lawyer story. I had no desire or dreams of becoming a lawyer. In undergrad, I came into undergrad as a computer science major. I wanted to be a computer programmer. Loved the programming courses, could not pass calculus to save my life. Took it twice, and the grade was not where I wanted it. So I kept dropping the calculus class and finally had to grapple with the fact that I was not going to be able to be a computer programmer. So as such, I changed my major multiple times. I became lost, honestly, at that point. And I was just trying to figure it out. I went from political science to paralegal studies to criminal justice. And finally, I landed on English. I love to read. I love to write. I journal every day. I have a couple of stories I've written, some books, but it's a hobby. And I'm not trying to publish at this point. And so I was just doing really well in English, got all A's in all my English classes. So it just became a good fit for me. Towards the end of my senior year, again, I was lost, didn't really know what I wanted to do. I decided I was going to go to grad school, get my master's in English, and I was going to be a student teacher. And one of my professors from paralegal studies, one of my many changes in course, I took one course from this lady, but she remembered me. And this is the importance of being teachers and the important role that teachers play in directing folks' lives that they may not even realize. But she stopped me on campus one day and said, "Kim, you're about to graduate, right?" And I told her, "Yeah." And she says, "Have you thought about law school?" And I was like, "No." And I had not thought about it. I was preparing to take the GRE so I could go to grad school. But just on her suggestion, I was like, why not? So I applied to law school, took the LSAT at the last minute, started sending my resume out to multiple universities. And I actually had gotten accepted at several. And it was also a really big confidence booster. I don't know why, but the narrative is that law is so hard and that you can't get in and it's super impossible. So I really didn't think it was going to work. And grad school was going to be my backup. But got into several law schools, and Vanderbilt was going to be my choice. But I got a letter from the University of Mississippi, and still struggling with diversity there. And as such, they invited me to come, and my tuition would be waived. Now, Vanderbilt is very expensive, so I was thinking $100,000 a year, free. Okay, so that's how I landed at the University of Mississippi School of Law.
Well, as a Vanderbilt law alum, I understand the price tag. I understand that choice, and University of Mississippi is a wonderful law school. Tell us about some of the primary activities that you were involved in during law school.
Yeah, law school was an interesting time for me because the University of Mississippi, especially the law school, is still struggling again with diversity. So I came in and there were like 18 students of color at that time. And by my second year, we had been narrowed to like 9. So I graduated with 9 other students of color in a class of like 280 some individuals. I participated in moot court. I was a part of the moot court board, and as such, traveled the nation doing competitions and things of that nature. I was president of the Black Law Students Association at that time, which was a really interesting time to do that because, again, the University of Mississippi, still getting first, had never had a Black dean at the law school. And in my second year, Dean Westerfield came, and he was from Loyola in Louisiana, and he was the first and only at this point Black dean that they had ever had at the law school. Unfortunately, my third year, he was a very active man. He went jogging every morning, 5 a.m. And on one of these jogs, he had a heart attack. So he ended up dying in my third year, but he left an indelible impression on all of us. But as such, we wanted to celebrate him in some way. As the president of the Black Law Students Association, we have this fundraiser dinner every year. And normally about 50 people will come. Some folks will sort of support us. It was a way we sort of made money. But because I had the strength of Dean Westerfield behind me, and it's a long story, I won't go around it, but we were trying to get Johnny Cochran to come, and had fallen short every time. And I got a phone call one day, and I said, hello, and he's like, this is Johnny Cochran. I'm like, y'all stop playing with me. I thought it was like my law school classmates playing with me. So I hung up on Johnny Cochran, and I did. And so then he calls me back, and he says, Miss Jones, that's my maiden name. He said, anytime my mother-in-law calls me and tells me that I need to be in Mississippi on X date, I have to respond to her. And what it turns out is one of our law students, we were all trying to get Johnny Cochran. Her mother knew Johnny Cochran's mother-in-law, right? And called her, and the mother-in-law calls him, and then he calls me. So anyway, Johnny came to this dinner, and we raised thousands of dollars as a consequence. And we had to move from our little bitty spot we normally have it to like this huge venue. He didn't charge us one dime to come. We just had to pay for his flight and his security's flight. He was so very gracious. He sat there and signed every book and took every picture. So that was sort of the highlight of my law school career. But that was the extent of my involvement, honestly, in law school. I was just trying to stay alive. I was just trying to get through and to graduate so I can make it to the next phase. So had a really close connection with my law school classmates, and still very much connected to them now. But it was an interesting experience.
Well, that was a fantastic story about Johnny Cochran. Thank you for sharing that. So tell us about what happened after you graduated up until you taking the position with the Shriver Center. I know you've had some fantastic and varied professional experiences.
Yeah, it's interesting because working where I do now, I understand sort of the context of what was happening in the time in a way that I had absolutely no idea at that point. Ole Miss is one of those, law schools that in the school itself, it's a beautiful campus if you've never been there. And lots of money gets poured into the University of Mississippi, lots of alumni. But, it really is a perfect sort of storm for the haves and the have-nots. And of course, at that point, I was just really broke. So I was one of the have-nots. But, I'm going to school with folks whose fathers are judges, whose parents have law firms. So they know what they're going to do when their law school career is over. Like they have a clear direction and no worries. Well, that was not my story. I didn't even know an attorney. I'd never met an attorney until certain attorneys, started coming to the law school to introduce themselves. One of the great things Dean Westerfield did was really just expose us to folks who were doing this. And one of the people I was exposed to was a gentleman by the name of Charles Victor McTeer. And he was like a civil rights legend in Mississippi. He graduated from Rutgers Law, when his mission was to come to Mississippi after, you have to think about 69, the Civil Rights Act was passed. So people were like pouring into the state at that time, trying to use the Civil Rights Act in a way to sort of tackle these challenges that were happening around voter suppression and voter rights for people of color, which they were still struggling with in a space like Mississippi, clearly being intimidated to either register or even vote at times. And so he came here with the specific intent to sort of tackle that. So that was in 72 when he came. So fast forward to like 1997, when I'm graduating law school. At this time, he had now developed a private firm. He had 2 offices in the state, and he was doing mainly defense. But anyway, so I just started mass mailing my resume out all over because I didn't know anybody. Got several of interviews and had an opportunity to work for, your traditional sort of big firm, as big as they get for Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi. But then I got a call from Mr. McTier, and he says, I really want you to come work with me. I need your help here in the Mississippi Delta, which is Greenville, where I live now. Wasn't really interested in coming to the Mississippi Delta. I was like, I can work in your firm in Jackson, Mississippi. But he's like, no, I need you here. But he's so well respected that, like, if Mr. McTier says he needs you in Greenville, then you come to Greenville. And so that is, in fact, what I did. I moved here. I didn't know anybody. And they just sort of surrounded me and loved me at that firm. And I worked with Mr. McTier for about 9 years as we represented Allstate, USF&G insurance companies, Ford Motor Company, GMAC, you name it. So it was just like car companies, and it was just insurance defense and things of that nature. And Mr. McTier was a very proud man. And I can remember one day one of the assurance adjusters called, and they were always trying to tell you how to practice law, although they didn't have law degrees. And one of them talked really snidely to him on this day, and he just wasn't having it. And he was like, I was like the managing attorney of the firm at that time. He said, pack all those cases up. He wrote a nice little professional letter and sent them all their files back. And then he just like brought us all into the conference room and said, we're gonna change up what we're doing. And we just started doing civil practice on the plaintiff side. So we would take cases, civil rights cases, discrimination cases, but we also did like 18-wheeler accidents and medical malpractice. So I got a lot of experience in trying civil cases in both state and federal court. Another interesting fact about Mr. McTier was he was one of those tobacco attorneys. And right around 1997, when I graduated, the money started coming in. So he was getting the big checks every quarter. So really he was in a space where he didn't have to do this anymore, but he chose to. He really loved the law, very passionate about it, in a way that I never was, honestly. He just really loved sort of the challenge, and he was very meticulous about writing those briefs. We did a lot of Supreme Court appeals and cases and things of that nature. But 9 years later, he called me into his office one day and was like, you know what, how many more $1 million verdicts can we get? This is exactly what he said, because I was like, well, I'm still getting them, so I could appreciate a few more. But he was ready to retire, and Lord knows he deserved. He had been practicing for 30 plus years. And so then I began my transition. I'd done civil law. I wanted to do something different. So I went to the local district attorney, who happened to be a Black woman at the time. There were only 2 female district attorneys in the state, and she was one of those 2. And I remember us having this really interesting conversation because she wasn't paying enough. And I said, well, I appreciate your offer, but give me 6 months. I'll take this salary, but if I show you that I can do what I can do, then in 6 months, if you will revisit it. And she said she would do that. Now, I didn't know anything about criminal law, but I knew what it meant to try cases. And if you're a prosecutor, trust me, you're trying a lot of cases. So I did come over and work with her. And after 6 months, she raised me to the top salary, to the max. As such, I was able to prove myself and got a lot of experience trying cases and stuff. And she was towards the end of her career too. I didn't know at the time I took the job. So after about a year or 2, she left. And another gentleman who was in our office became the district attorney. And he was a little different. Miss Joyce would let me sort of have free reign in handling these cases in the way that I want to handle them. And they always made fun of me in the office, but I didn't mind. They called me the social working prosecutor. She'd always say, we don't need any social workers in this office, because I wanted to meet the defendants. I want to meet their families. I want to understand their stories. I want to know the background before I made decisions around plea offers, and definitely made decisions around even what I'm taking to trial, what I'm going to indict. I really want to understand the context. That's something that prosecutors never get to see. Luckily enough, the woman who was the public defender at the time was also my best friend. And so she made it her business to drag those families over to my office. I want you to meet their mom and dad, their pastor. I met all these folks, right? The defendants, and really getting to know, because sometimes bad things happen to good people, or good people do things that I tell people all the time, you one bad night from going to jail, all of us. You know, we've all been to a party where we drank a little bit too much and we drove our cars home. We've all found ourselves in situations where we otherwise would not have been found in, but had the right police officer rolled up, it could have looked suspicious, and now you've been charged with conspiracy or something like that. So I've seen these situations happen to people, and I know how it happens. But anyway, finally, Miss Joyce sort of retired, and when she retired, the person that took over from her, he was like the law and order DA. So he was completely different, and he was a lot more hands-on and very political. He wanted to keep his position. So as such, I found myself in a conundrum, and always hitting, you know, we had a difference of opinion, and people could make phone calls to him, and he would come to my office. You got to such and such case, I want you to do this to it, even if it was sort of contrary to what I had decided to do in that case. And so ultimately, my defining moment, probably that really even brought me into the public interest space, was there was a young man, I think he was about, I don't know, 18 or 19. He had graduated high school. He had gone on to college. He was trying to make something of himself. But when he was in high school, he had been dating this girl who was 4 years younger than him. And he was like 2 months from the cutoff of statutory rape in Mississippi. And they had been in a relationship his entire high school career. So he had been dating this girl for like ever. Her family knew them, his family knew hers, and she was pregnant. And he had agreed to take care of the baby. You know, he was going to take care of the child and everything. And everybody was fine. He went off to college, and you know what college does to you. You learn, you move, you evolve, right? He met somebody else, and he didn't want to date her anymore. And so he sort of dumped this girl, and as such, she became angry. Her family became angry. And the way that they wanted to get back at him was to charge him with statutory rape all of a sudden. So that file drops on my desk. And of course, you know, the public defenders are bringing me the story. I'm trying to understand the context of what's going on. So as such, I decided, you know what, I don't want to do this case. Prosecutors have so much power, so much authority. And that's why the system that we see now can be abused so easily. A case can hit my desk and I can make it go away. You know, getting arrested and getting bail, that means nothing. There's a whole nother process that happens after that. And it starts with the district attorney's office. So you might get arrested and get bail, but if Kim Merchant decides she doesn't want to try your case or doesn't want to pursue it anymore, I can tell the police department, we're not going to pursue this case, and they dismiss it. Or I can take your case to the grand jury, and the grand jury could no-bill your case, meaning that they found there was not sufficient evidence to move forward. And because I decide I want to be this zealous advocate and want to continue, I want to get this case indicted, I can take it to the next grand jury and the next grand jury and the next grand jury until I finally get a grand jury to indict it the way I want to. The grand jury process is very biased because only one side comes into that space and argues their case. And so they hear your narration of what happened, and you get to choose what evidence you want to show them. But more importantly, you get to decide what you don't want to show them. So the indictment process is just so clearly biased and unfair. But anyway, so this was a case I was just going to make go away. I'm like, you're not going to use this office or what we do as a weapon against someone because you're upset. But they were people who were prominent in this community, apparently. I didn't know it at the time. And I made the phone call, and here comes the DA down the office to my office and says, down the hall, and says, what is happening with this case? And he said, oh no, you're going to indict this case. So he forced the indictment. Then when he got indicted, I was like, okay, here goes plan B, social worker, right? I'm going to give him a misdemeanor, contributing to the delinquency of a minor, and let him plead to that. And after 6 months, he can get it removed from his record, right? And on my way to the courthouse to plead this young man, the DA stopped me and said, what are you offering him? You know, so we had this conversation, and he says, oh no, he's going to get that felony. And I was like, really? And mind you, you know, I had murder cases I was trying that he never asked me about, but when it came to the phone call, so this was sort of my frustration in the politicized sort of criminal legal field. So I was struggling with heavy feet, walking over to the courthouse to do this plea, struggling with myself, like, what are you going to do? And finally, I got in that courtroom and it was like a light bulb came off. I don't know, but I just decided I'm gonna do what I said I was gonna do. And I gave him the misdemeanor. Trust me, before I got back to the office, he was standing at the door waiting on me. So the moment I hit that door, it was like, boom, he was going in. Didn't I just tell you? And you did what you wanted to do. And I was like, all I could say was, yep. And I looked at him like, do what you got to do at this point. I mean, I have to, actions have consequences. I didn't get fired that day, but I remember coming home and telling my husband, I'm either gonna get fired or I need to figure out what I'm gonna do next. And right at that time, a friend called and said, there's a position open at the Mississippi Center for Justice. They're about to open a new office in the Delta where we live, and they're looking for a managing attorney. And so I read the job description and I was like, somewhere I can use these social working skills. And so I applied. I was the first applicant and I actually got the job. And so it was just completely new to me. It was a new field. So I started working at the Center for Justice. I was the managing attorney they had 3 offices in Mississippi. And I was the director of what's called educational opportunities. Now, this is interesting. And this is the beauty of having a law degree. It just gives you the space to do so much. I'd never done public interest law. Here I go again, right? So from civil to criminal, and now I'm in this sort of public interest space. The interesting thing about nonprofit or even public interest work, and I found this in lots of organizations, is it really sort of gives you the freedom to do the work the way you want to do it. Unfortunately, I was an attorney who had never done this work and didn't have a whole lot of guidance. So I was just sort of figuring it out in the way in terms of the way it went. And I was doing the best I could with my team. Parents would come in with issues with students around expulsions and suspensions, and even students with disabilities not getting the services they needed. And we were just tackling those one by one, helping them out, doing good work. And then my supervisor comes in and says, they have this new program they're starting at the Shriver Center called the Racial Justice. It was called the Training Institute at the time. Do you want to be a part of our team? And I was like, sure, why not? So then began my journey. It was like this 6-month training program. And they were teaching things I had never heard of. Structural racialization, a term I'd never heard of. I hadn't even heard of implicit bias at the time. This was in it was 2014. It just wasn't as prevalent. So all these new concepts were being thrown at me and ideas. And all of a sudden I started just looking at the way in which we were doing our advocacy. And I was like, this can be done so much better. So I really took what I learned at the Institute, came back to my office and completely reworked the way in which just like they gave me a guidebook of some direction that I had just never had up to this point. It's great during these cases, and you'll see this in legal services a lot. Clients come in, we fix their problem. Clients come in, we fix their problem. But really, when you're doing that kind of work, you see these patterns and trends happening. You see these clients coming in with the same issue over and over again. And what the Institute teaches is that you take a more systemic approach. Then you have to investigate, why is this happening to this subset of people so prevalent? Why are all my clients Black boys? Why are the Black boys all getting kicked out of this particular school, or even across the state, if you look at the stats or the or the data. And so as such, we began a more systemic approach. We were still helping clients on the ground as they came in, but we used that information to tackle the more systemic issues up top. And so after I did the Institute in 2014, I've continued to be a coach for other teams through the Institute. I was on the faculty for the Institute moving forward. And then finally, and when was that, 2017, they called and said, we have some funding and we can hire a director. We've never had a director for the Institute before. Are you interested in applying? And I said, sure. So I applied for the Institute to be the director, and I got that job. And that's how I am now the director of the Racial Justice Institute. Long story, I'm sorry.
Well, thank you for that. You've had an amazing career to date, and I know you're going to continue to do amazing things. So this is a good jumping off point for us to talk about racial justice advocacy. What does that term mean, and what does it mean to do racial justice advocacy as an attorney?
Yeah, and this is something of great debate. We go back and forth in the Institute, and lots of times when people come to the Institute, I think there's a misimpression or idea around what it means when we say racial justice advocacy. So, lots of legal aid organizations do sort of this day-to-day one-on-one direct services with clients. And a lot of their clients are, in fact, people of color. And there's sort of this myth or idea that if we're representing people of color, we do race justice advocacy. I get that a lot when people are applying to the Institute in their application. And what we have to teach in the Institute, or really sort of shape their thinking, is unless you're really looking at this in a way where you're tackling the inequities that exist, or you're tackling sort of the disparities or disproportionality that you see, then you're not explicitly doing race equity advocacy. So the difference between regular advocacy and race justice advocacy is you are unapologetic and explicit around the disparities that exist, that you talk about them very clearly and succinctly when you're advocating in this, that these issues exist, that you do it with the lens of race equity, meaning anytime an issue comes up, you want to understand the data, like who is being impacted by this law the most, so that you understand that. And then you dig deep. You want to understand the history behind it. Like, why do these inequities exist? Why is this particular subset of folks being impacted differently than everyone else? Like, they make up 30% of the population, but they're 80% of the prison population. Like, there's an issue there that needs to sort of be researched and addressed and understood. And then once you understand sort of the system and why this sort of inequity exists, then you take a strategic approach to fixing that issue that addresses the inequity explicitly. Like, you could take a neutral thing and just sort of file litigation to change the rule. Lots of times we want to change the policy or change the rule to fix an issue, but does that eliminate the disparity? We have someone in the Institute from the MacArthur Foundation last year, and she has a safety and justice program. She pours millions of dollars into states all over this nation. She has like 27 sites where they've given money to communities and government to reduce the prison populations in their communities. And what she found after doing this for 4 years and tens of millions of dollars to these organizations is the population decreased, but the racial gap increased. So they have a lower overall prison population, but the number of people of color being locked up increased. And so she just really was wondering, like, how does that happen when they take these approaches? That's what happens when you take a neutral approach to a race-specific issue, is that you get sort of this unintended consequence as a result. And so, yeah, that institute really taught her the difference. So that's sort of the difference between just doing regular advocacy and doing explicit race equity advocacy.
So does racial justice advocacy mean that you approach things more from a class action perspective, or you go after legislative initiatives, all of the above? You still represent individuals who have what look like individual issues? Tell me more about how specifics work.
So all of the above. One of the things we teach attorneys in the Institute is, first of all, which is something that they don't teach in law school, is that when you're doing this advocacy work, it really has to be, whether it's race equity or otherwise, led by and identified by the community. So you have to be working with the community, and in this space, we are sort of a tool for the community rather than leading it. We're leaders as attorneys, and we're taught we have all the answers, and we like to swoop in and save the day. Sort of, that's how we've been taught to do. But when we do race equity advocacy, we really have to do it from a space of respect for the community and understanding their issues and working in partnership with them. And yes, that looks like litigation. I think race equity advocacy litigation looks different in the sense that our advocates have the complaint are unique in the sense that we tell the stories. We outline the disparities that we see around race. We include the stories of some directly impacted folks and what that looks like for them, to give the courts, the defense, and everyone else, put them on notice that this is an issue that we're tackling with this lens. And we're not going to say just, that these people were impacted. We're saying they're impacted because they are people of color. They are being impacted differently because of their race and their color. And that's what makes our litigation, I think, look different. One great example of a team that came from the Institute that's doing spectacular work in Washington is, the farm workers in Washington. And there's this exclusion for overtime. Why are agricultural workers excluded from overtime? There is no really reason why that would even make sense. How are they any different from anyone else that's working to make a living? When they dig into the history, especially in their state in Washington, around why farm workers and agricultural workers were excluded from overtime, they discovered sort of the racist background to that. And and how it was intentionally done to exclude. They didn't find their work valuable enough to make them overtime workers. And all this went into their complaint, and they challenged it. And as such, they just had this huge win where now a whole subset of people who never got overtime is entitled to it. In Washington, we're using their example now to sort of spread it across the nation. So those are some great examples of sort of doing this with a race equity lens. A lot of policy work is done by these attorneys as well, changing policies, legislation. Of course, it does make a difference. It can make a difference. It definitely helps move the needle. And you'll see sort of the right to counsel movement that happened in New York. And the idea that these folks were being evicted at large rates. And now, before you can be evicted from your home, you have a right to an attorney in New York. And New York is paying for that, paying for the defense attorneys to assist with that. And so that's a really great example of sort of a policy change that happens, not litigation, but policy, and the importance of that. And even the way they talk about it is different. So the way we frame and talk about things looks differently. They're talking about housing as a right. You know, you have a right to have affordable and safe housing, rather than thinking about it sort of as if you can afford it, or you know, you can get a safe house if you can afford it, or you're welcome to to live in this area if you have the means to which do it. But can you imagine a society where we say, regardless of how much money you make, everybody needs a roof over their head, and let's think about what it looks like to give them that, regardless of what they make. So.
When we were talking about this presentation over the past several weeks, you shared with me that there are some frequent misconceptions about racial justice advocacy. Can you share some of the frequent misconceptions with us?
Yeah, one of the ones I've already explained was just sort of this idea that if I represent a person of color, I'm doing race equity advocacy. That's the main one. A lot of special legal aid organizations come to the Institute with that idea, and we have to really sort of show them the difference between just representing individual clients who happen to be people of color versus taking a more intentional step or approach towards eliminating disparities that we see. And then that begs the second question, which I always get. So are we, and I've even gotten this from our board once, of people who really don't get it, but they'll say, are you telling, what about the poor white people? You know, are you telling us that we're supposed to ignore the needs of the white community? And so I have to always sort of address that. By no means is what we're saying is ignoring the white community, or ignoring the Latino community, or ignoring our Asian citizens, but what we are saying is, understand you live in America. And as such, these inequities exist across the board and in most spaces that you're in. So before you engage in trying to figure out how to fix this issue, you have to understand the issue. And one of the things that, you know, we feel real comfortable talking about gender, right? We feel real comfortable talking about disabilities. But when it comes to race, it gets icky. And we have been taught forever to not talk about race. It's not appropriate. It's not, you know, it's against every, especially in a space like Mississippi, right? It's not good etiquette to bring that up. And in some places, people will say you're being mean or ugly or intentionally trying to be divisive as such. So we're just getting to a space as a nation where we're starting to have these conversations that we have been sort of restricted or told for years that we don't have. And so, no, what I am saying is every community is unique. The experience of the communities of color are unique from the experience of a Latino community, from a Black community, from the Asian community, from the white community. So if there is an issue, you need to understand where the disparity exists. And if a disparity exists around race, you need to question why and examine and research until you figure out the why. Because you can have a diverse student body and a particular portion of that body is struggling academically. But the reason why the students of color are struggling, it could be an environmental issue. Whereas maybe the Latino students may be struggling because their English is their second language. So everyone has a unique reason why the disparity exists. And so you cannot give everybody tutors. Let's just give everybody tutors. They'll be fine, right? And what happens is the kids who are already advantaging, who are doing fine, tend to do better, and that's good. But the kids who are struggling still struggle because you have not gotten to the bottom of why they're struggling. So no, we do not ask you to ignore white community. But that's the one I get the most. What about the poor white people? Anyone who's being impacted negatively by policy should be addressed. And so we're not asking you to ignore the communities, white communities at all.
So tell us more about how the Institute's training program works and some of the various topics and techniques you use for the training.
So the Racial Justice Institute, we're going into our 8th year. We just dropped the application. In fact, we have one from UIC, which is great. And so we love having diverse people and diverse perspectives in the Institute. And so that's one that we haven't had before. So we just love to do that. But it is a 7-month training program. And the reason why it's so long is we're teaching race equity concepts, we're teaching tools, and we're teaching skills, and that takes time. So we give you 1 week out of 2 weeks out of the month, we meet, and we, for about 5 to 6 hours, it's online now because of COVID, of course, we introduce a new topic. So we talk about structural racialization, understanding the complexity of race, not just this idea that there is some sort of menacing or malicious actor out there hating some particular group. Race is so much more complex and dynamic than that. We talk about implicit bias, understanding bias and how it works. And most importantly, what do you do about it? How do you mitigate bias? We talk about doing your advocacy work through what we call systems thinking. And that is really diving below the surface, getting away from sort of those surface level strategies that we're used to, and diving below the surface and making sure we understand the why. So we teach systems thinking, we teach community lawyering. What does it look like and mean to work with community and partnership with them? We teach framing and communications. How do you talk about race in a way where people don't feel like it's divisive, where people will listen, starting with values that people can share. And we use what's called a VPSA model, but that's some communications jargon. And then we talk about organizational alignment. We talk about, yes, the advocacy that you do and the external work that you do is important, but it's also important to take a look within. So is your organization aligned so that you can successfully do race equity work externally? Because a lot of times we have people who really are curious about this area and want to understand it and go through the Institute, like they have a team of 3 or 4 people, but then they go back to their organization, they try to implement this and they hit a brick wall. And that's because internally they haven't been aligned to do race equity advocacy. So oftentimes if your organization is not on board to do that, if they're not in a space to move forward around this issue, then you're going to have a hard time doing the work externally. So those are sort of the areas that we teach on. 7 months. The beauty of the Institute is we take what's called a learning action model. So everybody comes to the Institute with an idea around an equity team project. So what is an issue that you're tackling that you would like to do with a race equity lens? Or what is that one issue that you kept seeing happening, but you just haven't had the space to do yet? Bring it to the Institute. As they're learning each of these components, they get to apply it to their equity team project to see how it happens. Because you can teach somebody something, but unless they're applying it, what do they say? Like 75% of what you teach goes out the door the moment the screen goes dark. So we want it to stick so that when they do leave the Institute, it sticks and they're continuing to do it. And then another component of the Institute that's really important is the coaching aspect. Each team gets a coach. When I left the Institute, I coached teams every year for about 3 to 4 years before I became the director, of course. And so the coaches are critical. These are people who've done it, who've been through what you've been through, who do the work successfully, and really try to match them with a coach who does similar work like they do, who comes from an organization similar to them. So someone who's sort of equally matched with those teams. So you take all that together, and that's sort of the Institute. After the 7 months, they then transition to the network. So we have a network. Everybody that's been through the Institute, we stay connected. We're a very tight group, and we have a very active network. We bring them monthly, what I call ongoing learning sessions, where we're bringing them, because, race, it's evolved. And after COVID and George Floyd and all that, it has really, it's picked up in terms of the conversation. So we keep them abreast of what's happening, what the discussions are, what that looks like, and we get together and sort of bring that to them. We have an online platform that we use where we share resources. And because people ask me the same questions all the time. Kim, I need this. And I was like, go to the platform. It's got like 8 articles and samples right there. So we created like this database of information and sample complaints and discovery and everything else you will need to sort of be successful. So that's sort of the Institute and the network in a nutshell.
If law students are interested in racial justice advocacy, this isn't a part of many law schools' curriculum at this point. How can they learn more and be trained in this area?
That is a great question. I say you just have to take ownership of your dreams. And I know they didn't teach it at University of Mississippi. And so if that's something that you know you want to do, you have to find the space for that. Like I'm about to interview for a summer internship at the Shriver Center working with the Institute from UIC. So I'm going to get resumes right now and look, and somebody will work with me during the summer. So you have to put yourself in those spaces if in fact it's not something that you learn at the law school. And even as a director of the Institute, and people love to say, oh, Kimberly Merchant, the expert on race equity or expert on race, which always makes me cringe because I don't know anybody can be an expert on this. But as such, I'm constantly reading. So I have to continue to educate myself, constantly reading, constantly watching, constantly hearing all of these different perspectives around race. So you have to just take ownership of your own dreams and your own desires. If that's something you want to do, you have to put yourself in a space, learn as much as you can, because law schools are still sort of maybe struggling to some extent to catch up. I promise you, probably with the next 3 to 5 years, schools are going to start offering a course in that where people can sort of get in that space if that's something they're interested in.
So did I hear you say that you're hiring for a summer internship?
Mm-hmm.
And so is this something that people can write you about, or is there an announcement someplace that they can go and apply through a portal?
Well, I think it's through UIC. So whoever the person is who coordinates that has coordinated that with our HR people. So I did a job description. Yeah. And I have 2 interns now. They're not law students, but I had interns working with me. So we work with interns all the time and looking for them.
I thought I heard through UIC, but I wanted to make sure that was what you said. Okay.
It is UIC,
excellent.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we have a question from a member of the audience who works in the diversity, equity, and inclusion area. And she's wondering about whether the Institute is partnering with corporations on issues of racial justice. And she notes that there tends to be a tremendous knowledge gap on how to drive systemic change among executives and diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners.
That is a great question. So no is the quick answer. Now, after George Floyd and even COVID, we had this huge influx, of course, of demands. And I've had some really great, unique opportunities to work with folks as such. And I'm telling you my quick story, and then I'm going to get back to it. But I get this email, and the caption says, "Hello from Facebook." And I'm like, yeah, spam, delete. So I promise you, I deleted this woman's email maybe 3 times. And she found me on LinkedIn and sent me a message. And LinkedIn, is a little more reputable, right? You can't trust what's coming through email. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to give her 30 minutes. I don't even know if this is real, right? And I sent it to my development director, and I says, I don't know if this woman's real, but I'm going to give her 30 minutes, see what she's talking about. And I guess, I didn't even think about it, but she Googled this woman, and she's like, oh yeah, it's real. But this woman just basically Googled racial justice, and my name came up. And she reached out. Facebook was giving like $10 million away to organizations that did racial justice work, but they didn't know what it looked like. They didn't know what would be authentic. So they were just bringing on consultants to help with that. So I was sort of a part of the helping them shape how to decide who to select. But, so some of these unique opportunities, but that's not what we normally do. And one of the things we had to sort of decide on was, we don't want to have mission drift. We don't want to get too far away from our mission. And our mission at the Institute is really about working with public interest and legal aid attorneys to transition a way in which they look at and do their work to expand the knowledge base around race equity, to sort of, put them into these spaces across the nation so that we're pushing a movement. And we really feel like we're pushing a movement. And so we've had lots of corporations, banks, you name it, even Facebook asking Starbucks to do sort of take what we do with the Institute and translate it to corporate. It doesn't work. The one organization I did agree to work with, and I'm so some of you may have heard of, is after, right before, in March of 2019, before everything shut down, the last training that I did in person I was in Chicago, and I was doing a training for the Association of Pro Bono Attorneys. And we were really moving into that space because I feel like big law has a role to play, and they really can add a lot of value and power to the work that our advocates are doing. And so I thought that was a great opportunity. So anyway, we did this training with these pro bono attorneys. And so when George Floyd happened, they started coming together, and now they've decided to do the spinoff of what's called the Law Firm Antiracism Alliance. And so when they started talking about having this alliance, even before it was announced to everyone, they called, and I was participating and helping them think through what that would look like. So that's sort of corporations to me, because it's big law. And the issue with big law, and I wrote an article about this, and I get it resonated with a lot of people because I get so many emails where people ask me about it or just say, I'm so glad you said it, is that they are part of the structure, and they have their own examination sort of to make in terms of what does it look like to work at one of these large law firms, and what does it even look like to work in a space or in a field where 85% of the attorneys are still white men, and in their organization, and leadership is still predominantly white, and the struggles that big law has in recruiting attorneys of color, and as well as keeping attorneys of color. What does it look like to retain them? So, I mean, corporations are a whole nother animal to tackle. It's a huge subset, and they're doing their own work right now through the Law Firm Antiracism Alliance with my sort of support in the background. But I'm focused on continuing our mission with the legal aid organizations and with public interest organizations.
So our law school is celebrating Diversity Week this week, and this program is part of that. Can you describe from your perspective why diversity is so important for the legal profession?
And I think that's why now you hear people say DEI, why when they say diversity, they talk about equity and inclusion. Diversity is important, but diversity is simply a tool. It is a tool in sort of the journey of getting to equity and inclusion. Diversity is important because, and one of the things we talk about in the Institute is it's no longer a moral imperative. At some point, it was a moral imperative, right? People say it's just the right thing to do. You should have diverse people in your organization. But we now know, based on lots of studies and scientific proof, that having a diverse people tackle any complex issue increases your chances of coming up with an innovative outcome and a successful outcome by miles if it is a diverse team. And the reason why is because anytime you have a homogenous group of people sort of working on something, they have a limited perspective. So there's a perspective of different, so we have to learn how to value what people bring to the table in terms of their background and experience that isn't tied to any law degree, right? That can help shape, like I said, innovative solutions to problems and issues. So anytime we're trying to tackle something, I'm always thinking like, who's missing from the space? Who's missing from the room? What perspective are we missing? That's why when UIC applied, I was like, great, you know, we do not have, and I don't even know what that looks like because eventually they're going to graduate, right, and become attorneys. But we have to think about like, what does that look like for the Institute? We have voices missing from our space. So that's why diversity is important, but diversity can only work when there's equity and inclusion. And that's why organizations tend to see this turnover, because as a person of color, you come to a space, if you don't feel welcome, if you don't feel like you fit in, if you don't feel like your voice is valued, or that you have the space to even share your voice, then you will eventually feel dejected and you crave, and you'll continue to seek a space that is that. And that's sort of the struggle sometimes of people of color. And that's why you see them sort of moving from space to space. They're still seeking sort of that inclusion that's so lacking, and it's sort of intangible and hard to describe and understand what it looks like, but that's generally what's missing.
So Kim, a couple of final questions for you. You told me you're a big reader. Have you read any good books or seen any good movies that you will recommend to our audience as something that might be meaningful to them?
So right now I'm reading Caste by Isabella Wilkerson. She also wrote a book called The Warmth of Other Suns, which really talks about sort of the migration up north, which, you know, a lot of people migrated from Mississippi to Chicago. We call Chicago like the second Mississippi. So it was interesting, a beautiful book written by Isabella Wilkerson, just because she shares actual stories of families that migrated and the why. Caste is her new book, and it's an examination sort of the structure and the system that we see now that created sort of segregation and classism and this hierarchy. So that's what I'm reading. I'm constantly reading these books because, like I said, race is ever evolving. So she's a different voice, a different perspective. The book that I really like is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram Kendi. And the reason why I really like, and I'm reading it again for the third time, and I've got all these tabs and highlights and stuff in it, is because he does a beautiful job of telling his own story, weaving that in with the actual history, the real history, right? The history you don't learn in school around America and race. And then on top of that, he weaves in his perspective around race. And he does it in a really simplistic way. It's not academic, like it's an easy read. And he just breaks it down. He's like, you know, a lot of people like to say, I'm not racist. And he's really saying, at this point, you're either actively working to eradicate racism, which it takes everybody to do it. It can't just be the people of color. It's impossible to do without everyone, especially our white counterparts. And so he talks about how being actively addressing racism by being anti-racist, but to say that you're not racist is to be silent, because it's like you're not actively working, you're not speaking out against it. And to be silent on race is to be complicit with what's happening. And so he does a really great job of explaining that in a way that, again, a unique perspective that a lot of these other books can get really technical and heavy, and it takes you months to read because you just can only read like a chapter at a time. So Dr. Kendi's book is great. Movies, I watched Judas and the Black Messiah. You know, I heard of Fred Hampton, and, you know, we hear about the Black Panther movement. And honestly, my biased perspective around the Black Panther movement had always been like, aren't they sort of like the Black version of the Proud Boys? Like, you hear that sometimes, like, were they like a little extreme at that time? But the beauty of this movie is it really shows that the Black Panther movement was really about Black power, in a way of saying, you know what, you don't have to take care of our kids because we'll make sure our kids are okay. We're taking care of our community. But in that moment, they were fighting against sort of the Jim Crow era of racism. Like, you say we free, you know, we got these laws on the book, but we're still not free. So we're demanding it. And that was right in that moment where people were really trying to get to a space where Black people were in fact liberated. So it was a different perspective around Fred Hampton and the Black Panther movement with some great actors. The other one is the U.S. versus Billie Holiday. Also is a really great story. And both of them, I know Judas and the Black Messiah was nominated for a Golden Globe, but I just recently watched U.S. versus Billie Holiday, and that was also a really great movie.
Well, thank you for those recommendations. We were fortunate to have Dr. Kendi as part of the UIC Conversations, just a series a couple of weeks ago. And
wow.
We also recently heard from Fred Hampton. So those tie into some things we've been talking about. So the final question, and we had it on our list to talk about, and we also got the same question from an audience member. What's one thing that you know now that you wish you had known as a law student, or phrased differently? What piece of advice might you have for some of our students who are about to graduate?
I would say give yourself grace. Once you graduate law school, you really don't know where you're laying or what you'll do, it's okay to figure it out. So be kind to yourself and give yourself grace, and be courageous enough to shift if necessary, to do something different. If you find yourself in a space that you thought would be great and it turns out not, that's the beauty of having a law degree. You find a job, find something that that you love to do, because then you won't mind getting up in the morning and going to work. And I think I feel very blessed having a job where I love what I do. I love the people I work with and the community that I work with, the attorneys that I work with. And so, and I know a lot of people are not in that space. I've been in that space where I was doing the billable hour. It was not for me. Some people enjoy that, and that's great. But it was really quickly, I learned that was not where I wanted to be. And trust me, I get offers and opportunities all the time to take these jobs that'll pay me lots more money. But I know it's not the space that I'm going to wake up every morning and be happy with the job that I'm doing. And so I'm also blessed to be in a space where I don't have to worry about the paycheck to have my job. So if, give yourself grace while you figure it out, but also make sure you love what you're doing. Life is way too short, as we see, to be in a job where we're not happy.
Well, Kim, thank you for spending time with us this evening and talking about your work with the Racial Justice Institute and your background. You have a very inspirational story, and I look forward to continuing our relationship with the Institute, hopefully with a team participating in the training. Thanks to the audience for being with us this evening. Everyone, be well and take care. Goodbye.
Have a good evening. Thank you guys for having me.